I thought my first free job would feel like a fairly safe step. The customer was my father-in-law. I wasn't charging him anything, and I'll never charge him, because even without this experiment, I'll be the one looking after his bike from now on. So there wasn't exactly a huge amount of commercial pressure. But shortly before leaving the flat, something occurred to me. This was the threshold between everything being theoretical and me actually doing the job. I know I'm competent enough in a training workshop. I've passed the qualification and I've rebuilt my own bike. I spent far too much money building a toolkit. But this would be the first time I'd take those tools, inspect somebody else's bike, and hand it back to them as their mechanic. And then suddenly, I was nervous. As we know, the next milestone in this experiment is to complete 10 jobs for free. Friends and family, and anyone willing to trust the newly qualified mechanic with their bike. The idea is to get the reps in and build experience before I ask anybody to pay me. Real bikes, real problems, and real customers. And this was job number one. My first ever customer was David, my father-in-law. Shout out to you, David. David lives well outside the area I intend to serve, so this was also my first attempt at taking the workshop somewhere else. I packed all the tools I thought I'd need into a suitcase, and I brought the service to him. David relies quite heavily on a large national retailer for his bike maintenance. I won't name them, because this isn't intended to be an attack on another business. But 6 months earlier, he'd taken his bike in for a service and ended up having most of his drivetrain replaced, along with his brake pads and all of his cables. The final bill was considerably higher than he'd expected. We can't tell whether all that work was necessary. I didn't get to inspect the bike beforehand. David agreed to the work, and 6 months have passed since then. But there were things on the paperwork that I found interesting. The brake pads were recorded as having 50% life remaining, but replacement was recommended. The chain was replaced, but its original wear measurement wasn't recorded. So there was no real way for David, or for me, to understand why some of that work had been recommended. And that made me think about the kind of service I want to provide for my customers. I don't just want to tell somebody that their bike needs work. I want to show them what I've found, explain why it matters, and then let them decide if they want to proceed. David had also noticed a new squeak around the front of the bike. He was planning to go for a ride over the following days, so the job was to complete a full safety check, investigate the noise, and ensure that the bike was in good condition for the ride. The first thing I did was inspect the bike using the customer report that I designed after finishing the course. Frames and forks, wheels, hubs, tyres, brakes, cables, gears, drivetrain. Every part of the bike has a place on the checklist. And this was the first time I'd used that report with an actual customer. Once the safety check was complete, I stopped. I hadn't started fixing anything yet. Instead, I filled in the report with everything I'd found and I sat down with David. I explained the condition of the bike. I showed him the areas that I thought needed attention. I explained to him what I was recommending and why. Then I explicitly asked for his approval before doing any of it. Now, admittedly, he was my father-in-law. I was working for free, and he was unlikely to throw me out for suggesting I clean his chain. But to me, the process still mattered, because this is how I want the service to work when the customer isn't somebody I know. Inspect first, explain the findings, agree on the work, then proceed. No surprises, no pressure, and no unexpected bill at the end. Once David approved the work, I started with the drivetrain. The chain and cassette had both been fitted during a previous service. The chain measured below 0.5% wear, so it had plenty of life left. But after 6 months of use, the drivetrain had built up a decent amount of old lubricant, dirt and grime. So I fully degreased and re-lubricated the chain. I cleaned the cassette, the rear mech and the jockey wheels. I also explained some simple chain maintenance to David, because if he keeps that chain clean and lubricated, and we replace it before it gets excessively worn, that cassette should survive 3, maybe even 4 chains, and cassettes are more expensive than chains. That little bit of knowledge could save him some money in the future. Then I found a more immediate problem. The back wheel wasn't spinning freely. The brake pads were rubbing against the disc, so I recentered the caliper, cleaned the disc, and I checked the wheel again. Easy. The brake levers also had more travel than I would have liked. I improved them by using the barrel adjusters and the brakes were working safely, but I've recommended we replace the inner brake cables at the next visit, just so I can set them up properly. And then there were the cable ends. All 4 of them had been left way longer than necessary. The front gear cable was so long that the crank was flicking it on every rotation, so I shortened them and tidied everything up. There were other jobs too. I re-greased the pedal threads and I worked through all the grime that accumulated around the bike. Individually, none of these was a dramatic repair, but together, they affected how the finished bike felt. And apparently, I'm incapable of seeing those details and leaving them alone. Once I started cleaning, I wanted to clean everything. All the awkward little corners and all the places that the dirt and grime had built up. All the details that most people probably wouldn't notice. And I enjoyed doing it. But it also highlighted something I'm going to have to learn. I can't provide that level of detail cleaning for every customer unless they're paying for that level of service. Time has value. And if this is eventually going to become sustainable, I need to understand where each service begins and ends. There's the work the bike needs, there's the work that the customer has agreed to, and then there's the work that the detail-obsessed mechanic wants to do just because he's noticed some dirt behind the jockey wheel. And those aren't necessarily the same thing. Still, this was my first job, it was David's bike, and I wanted it right. Once I'd finished, I was showing David what I'd done. I talked him through each completed job, I reminded him about the work I'd recommended for next time, and I explained how he could look after the chain between services. And then it was time to find out whether any of it actually worked. I took the bike out first. The gears were working, the brakes felt safe, and the back wheel was spinning freely. Then David took it out too, and he was happy. There was only one unresolved issue, the squeak. I hadn't actually found its source, so I explained that to him, and he said he couldn't hear it anymore. So I can't honestly claim that I diagnosed it, and I can't tell you exactly what part of the work made it disappear. But the bike apparently had a squeak when I arrived, and I left it without one. So I'll take it. Something else happened during the service. Brenda, my mother-in-law, had been listening while I explained and report to David. Shout out to you, Brenda. And afterwards, she told me how impressed she was with the way I spoke to him. Not just the work, my manner. And that might have been the most important piece of feedback from the entire job, because I already had some evidence that I could perform the mechanical processes. But what I hadn't tested was whether I could look after a customer. Could I explain a problem clearly? Could I recommend work without making someone feel pressured? Could I give them confidence in the bike and the person working on it? Because that side of the job is incredibly important to me. I want the customer to understand what I'm recommending, what's urgent, what can wait, and why it matters. The report helped me do that. But the day also showed me how inexperienced I still am. My brother-in-law chatted with me throughout most of the job. Shout out to you, Pete. He was genuinely interested in what I was doing and this new direction I'm taking. And I really enjoyed chatting with him. But it was also mildly distracting because nothing is automatic for me yet. I'd use a tool, put it down, and then spend the next few minutes trying to work out where I'd put it. I had the knowledge, I had the tools, and I had the process, but I hadn't developed a rhythm yet. I need a better system for where everything goes while I'm working. I need to become comfortable talking while maintaining my sequence. And I need to understand how long jobs actually take when I'm not working alone on my balcony. Those things will only come through repetition, and that's exactly why this milestone is 10 free jobs and not one. When I started this experiment, the qualification felt like the point where I became a mechanic. Then rebuilding my bike felt like proof that I could actually use what I'd learned. But this was different. This time someone handed me their bike. I inspected it, I documented what I'd found, I asked for permission before proceeding, I completed the work, and then I handed it back to them. I thought this first job was going to test whether I was mechanically competent outside of the training workshop. And obviously it did. But mechanics wasn't the only point. The real test was whether I could provide the service I'd spent the last few months imagining. And I think I can. I'm not efficient yet. Nothing is automatic, and there's still a huge amount I can improve. But I love doing the work. David seemed happy, and I came home feeling like my first job went well. Then later that evening, David sent an unprompted message to Gemma, my wife, and his daughter. Gem? He didn't send it to me, and I hadn't asked him for feedback. He'd simply taken his bike out, and he wanted her to know. That alone made me incredibly proud. The bike wasn't just working when I was standing next to him. He'd taken it out again and it was running perfectly. And then he sent another message, and honestly that got me. Because this experiment started with a question. Could I learn a completely new skill in my 40s and become competent enough that someone might actually pay for it? I haven't reached the paying customer milestone yet, but after my very first job, someone is already willing to put their name behind mine and recommend me to other people. Not because I asked him to, because I didn't. And not because he was appearing in a video, but because he was happy with his bike and the way I looked after him. For the first time, I didn't just feel qualified. I felt validated. Job number 1 is complete. 9 to go.